Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to House General and Housing. We are still Wednesday, April 30th, and we are continuing with our testimony on S-127, which is the Senate analog to the House Housing Bill, and will probably become the vehicle for the final housing bill. Again, we have before us a draft, which is the result of a lot of very excellent work by House Commerce on the use of a project-specific tax increment financing device known as CHIPS. This morning, we had it presented to us by Chair Marcotte and Representative Branning, the Vice Chair. We heard a walkthrough by our Legislative Counsel, John Gray. Our next witness will be Alex Farrell, who is the Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development, who will tell us how he feels about the major issues presented here and the changes worked by the Commerce Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Alex Farrell, Commissioner at the Department of Housing and Community Development. So thank you. I will mostly focus on the changes that have been made that you've been discussing here today. But I think one thing to just have in mind as you reflect on my comments and reflect on what you may or may not do here. It's a comment that John Gray made just before he stepped away, which is, maybe don't try to solve every housing issue with this. And that's coming from me. I oversee a lot of programs that do try to tackle very specific housing issues between VCDP, various tax credits, VHIP. And so I understand the level of subsidy that those bring that very specifically enable things like a covenant that can be enforced, comes with staff to enforce covenants, et cetera. So, the goal here is to enable more housing by providing a financing tool for that infrastructure. And I just want to keep that in mind, that this is a piece of the funding stack. Other funding will likely come in play in many of these housing developments, our existing funding that will come with those restrictions, affordability restrictions, those covenants, and you can achieve those aims through those other mechanisms. I think other folks in the community, including Maura from VHFA, have made similar comments. Again, if you want to hear from her, I'd recommend hearing directly from her. As for you were ending on the discussion of the primary residences, I just recommend you hear from the league on this. VEPC flagged that they'd have concerns about municipalities' ability to enforce this. John made the point that that's kind of between the municipality and the developer. I think we all agree with the goal. We agree with the goal of wanting these to be primary residences, whether the mechanism is an HOA that manages that or some other. I'm not certain that municipalities will always have a mechanism to enforce this or the staff to do so. I have a staff that enforces VHIP covenants, and I know that that's cumbersome. So that's all I can say on that. I don't have any more expertise. So I just say hear from the league. But I agree with the intention there. We want these to be primary residences for sure. So I'll talk a little bit about the location criteria, and I benefited from listening. I did listen in on your conversation earlier, so I appreciate that Commerce added back in Tier 2. I think that's imperative in this. I mean, a lot of areas by definition are going to be excluded from, if not Tier 1A, certainly excluded from Tier 1B, simply because they don't have the infrastructure. And so it feels backwards for me that we would exclude areas outside of Tier 1B. We would love for that infrastructure to get extended. So then, perhaps they could be remapped and added to that area. The next comment I'm going to make will just be.
Let me interrupt you there because this is specific to that. Yeah. What's your reaction to this? And I'll just try to describe it. For Tier 2 right now, the only way someone in Tier 2 can avail themselves of this is if they have a permit, Act 150, 250,
Act 250.
Act 250 permit. what if, and I'm not advocating this yet, I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think what I hear you saying is what we're talking about here is extension of infrastructure. So what if we were to state that a project that's in tier two sort of allow a bootstrapping? In other words, if it's in tier two and it will have the infrastructure that would have put it in tier one through the financing device that's being contemplated, then it's eligible.
Well, a way I would approach that is actually, thank you, Mr. Chair, that ties in with sort of this next piece, which is that basically if it's in tier two, it's required to have its Act 250 permit upfront just to apply.
Yeah,
I see that as problematic. Well, I think you could replace that and address what you're discussing here by requesting a letter from the RPC saying that this project would be consistent with future land use.
with future land use.
Yeah, so there's the future land use mapping effort, though I want to be careful not to say it's consistent with the future land use mapping, because let's say perhaps there's an area designated as a planned growth area because it has eligible infrastructure, whatever. This is adjacent to that, but had that been there, to your point, perhaps it could have been added. I don't want to put that project in a position of having to spend all of the money and resources and time on their permitting before they can even get to the point of applying to this.
I understand that, but you don't feel we would need to actually reference the fact that that with the contemplated, so you're saying with the contemplated infrastructure in place, the RPC would recommend that the project is consistent with future land use?
I think that's reasonable. In fact, I think the way I would approach the whole location criteria discussion in general is I would actually scrap the location criteria.
Yeah.
Because we have robust local zoning, we have robust state permitting, robust ANR permitting. Depending on what other sources we bring into this, there's significant federal requirements. My team will do an environmental review. It's another situation where I'm not sure we have to solve land use problems in this, which is a financing tool. And that location criteria could instead be replaced by a letter of support from the RPC that says this is consistent with land use planning.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, not at all. You actually brought me exactly to where I wanted to go with that, which is that I think it's redundant of us to be including location criteria in something that's a financing tool. These folks are going to have to go through all the permitting no matter what. And I don't think anyone in this room debates that that's cumbersome and significant. So, and
Sorry, can I just confirm? So you would also take out on page 9, section 1, that says an area for the tier 1A or tier 1B, you'd also take out that language as well, just like absolute scrap.
I wouldn't constrain it geographically at all.
Okay.
You know, I mean, a clean way to do it could just be not eligible in tier 3. But, when I work through that logic, I'm not sure you even need to say that, because I'm not sure any of a project utilizing this financing could ever happen in tier 3 anyway. So I think it's just redundant of the permitting that's already in place. But I want to be clear, it ought to be eligible in tiers 1A, 1B, and tier 2.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure location criteria is necessary in this. Now, setting that aside, I'll just specifically to the issue of whether it's in location criteria or not, the issue of requiring the Act 250 permits upfront in these areas that aren't exempt. That is problematic to me. I don't know if there's another way to achieve.
I'm sorry, what, could you go back, Stefan? I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I just was informed that one of our bills made it onto the Senate floor, so,
Congratulations.
okay, which is it that you,
Well, I
missed.
having said, I'd recommend pulling the location criteria, recognizing you could do that and still have language around requiring the Act 250 permits up front for projects not exempt. I just want to speak to that more specifically, just to say that is a lot of expense that projects have to go through. I mean, you could talk to a developer that could give you a better sense. And again, it just feels like another way that these areas that aren't already exempt from Act 250, we're now giving them just one more thing to layer another hurdle to layer on top, preventing them from accessing a tool that I think in the administration's mind would hopefully benefit some of those areas adjacent to just outside of exempted areas. So that's all that I had to say on the location criteria. Any questions on that? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So what you're saying is that it eliminates the need for somebody to have that expense and use all that time and they wouldn't be able to be eligible.
I think having that requirement anywhere in here is going to be too cumbersome for many projects, or rather a developer is just not going to take the risk of taking on the process and the cost of their Act 250 permitting before they even know that this financing tool that may be make or break for them is even in place.
That's why I'm confused, because I asked John that question about needing the contracting and the permitting, and he said, you don't.
You need your local permits, and you need a contract complete before you can apply to VEPSI.
But then that's that big
That's right.
expense.
You don't, wait, you need that before you can apply to VEPSI. You can start that process anytime you want. That's what he thought your question was. There's no requirement that you need your permits before you do the contract, local permits before you do the contract. There's no order. But before you walk in the door to VEPSI with hope of success, that is, you need A, your local permits. B, you need either to meet the location criteria that are in there, like you're in tier 1, or you have an Act 250 permit.
But aren't you suggesting that we get a
What he's saying is he doesn't, who would do that? He's saying that an Act 250 permit is hard to get, and if all it does is allow you to walk in the door to VEPSI, you might not do it. That's what he's saying.
And VEPSI may not approve your application.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you for that. All right. Yeah, I think maybe I'll pause there. That's probably all I want to share. Are there any questions about other provisions in here that folks want to ask me about?
So you're suggesting to eliminate the location criteria because you say it's redundant. How would you be able to, I'm going to use the word qualify for lack of a better word, for VEPSI?
Location wouldn't be a factor in VEPSI's evaluation.
It would be for the other permitting.
That's right. They'd still, for the project to happen, they'd still need to get permits. Wetlands permits if necessary, Act 250 permits if necessary. Or if they're exempt, then they're exempt. And so that is in itself incentivizing people to build in tier 1A and 1B, or to stay under the Act 250 threshold in tier 2.
So they're risking whether or not they would be able to be eligible for VEPSI.
If they're in tier 2, yeah.
And I can just speak for some of our programs. We certainly take permitting into account, but my VCDP program, for example, doesn't disqualify a project just because it falls in a certain geographic location. It goes through environmental review, so we'll look to make sure that if they're in a floodplain, they have done certain remediation, et cetera. But that's part of a very different type of program with very different requirements. This being a financing tool for infrastructure, the project and the infrastructure is going through other layers of permitting that are already going to ensure that it meets whatever location or
BHIP, for example, is location agnostic, right?
VHIP's location agnostic. That's right. With some flood area exceptions now.
Did you? No question.
Can I make an assumption and then correct me if I'm wrong?
Sure.
So we've talked about changing the location criteria language. Whether we remove it altogether or if we add our own language in, Can you just confirm whether or not you would be comfortable or supportive of us changing the effective date?
So, sure. So the effective date, as I understand it, is, you're talking the effective date of 21A,
Yeah.
Yeah,
which adds in tier two once.
True, right.
in 2028.
January 28th.
Uh, I suppose I need to better understand why they chose that date, aside from that's when they assume maps will be coming.
That's
That's
all they
why.
told- that's what they told us.
I guess I'm,
They, in fact, they think it's a year after the map.
so I suppose it feels like another instance where I'm not sure they need to specify a date because, but by nature of referencing tier two, you know, this ought to be effective whenever there is a tier two. So you can bump that up, and if there isn't a tier two to reference, then I don't see that as an issue. So it could be effective as of 7/1 this year. And if there isn't a tier two, projects can't be eligible under the tier two criteria by the nature of there not being a tier two. So I'm not sure you need to have a date so far out.
Well, one of the things that you should think about, because you might want to think about it a little more, is my understanding of. I mean, one option for us is to keep the criteria, the location criteria, but address tier two and essentially make sure that a project which has not an Act 250 permit, but a project in tier two that's going to have infrastructure with the financing, and that an RPC says that's okay, that it's in. Then what this thing does, this effective date, essentially says, yeah, and all the rest of tier twos becomes open, it's open season. It's all the rest of tier two is okay, starting on that date in 2028, which means the legislature, if it doesn't want to open up tier two entirely, in other words, it would have to contract it. In other words, it puts the burden on the legislature to come up with some alternative. Absent some alternative, it seems to me that I might be wrong, but my first reading of that date is that it declares exactly what you would like to happen for tier two on that date.
That all in tier two would be eligible,
Yeah.
which is what I would like to happen. I'm just,
Want it to happen sooner.
well, I would like it to happen sooner. And I'm not sure it's an issue
Yeah, okay,
for that.
yeah.
One use case that I could see, for example, we haven't seen a new mobile home park established in quite some time. I could see this perhaps being a mechanism, and it's likely that's not going to happen in tier 1A or 1B. It would likely happen somewhere in tier two.
Because
The amount of space,
Uh-huh.
and generally it's probably going to be green space.
Okay. Any final questions of Alex before we let the man go?
I'll stay in the room.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Thank you all.
See you.
Good to see you.
Our next witness, Holly Major. Who's Director of Policy and Special Projects at VHCB.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all this morning. And do I still need to state my name for the record? Holly Major, Director of Policy and Special Projects for Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. I'm really happy to be here this morning talking about this provision to finance infrastructure, because in our role supporting financing affordable housing development, we really see the cost of infrastructure as a critical one that stretches the existing affordable housing resources that we have, and one that for a long time we've been talking about the need for additional sources to cover. So there's exciting progress happening here. I'm really glad to follow Commissioner Farrell, because where I want to start today is with a report that his department led last year. So Act 181 last year asked to put together a study committee to look at incentives for affordable housing development, and that was led by the department, but also had VHCB, VHFA, and the Land Access and Opportunity Board participating. And we were looking at what can we do to further incentivize the development of affordable housing that meets the needs of Vermont communities. And the very first recommendation in that report was to have project-based tax increment financing for mixed income communities. So this bill is really running with that recommendation. We really appreciate the purpose language in the bill now to encourage that development of primary residences for low and moderate income Vermonters, because that's where we see the real need is. We hear a lot about the need, the housing shortage in the state. The housing needs assessment says we need that 24 to 36,000 homes. But the other thing the housing needs assessment says that this decade, for the same time period, we're going to see a projected growth of 13,000 low income households in Vermont, and that we need another 3,200 homes to meet the needs of Vermonters exiting homelessness. So taken together, that's 15,000 homes. That's about half of that growth must be available to the Vermonters who are low and moderate income. And that's what this purpose language tries to achieve. Where we think it can be strengthened is including more provisions to really focus and target CHIP towards the development of those low and moderate income homes. And one of the primary reasons for needing that additional focus beyond what is in the bill of that purpose is because there's an inherent incentive in TIF, in tax increment financing, to use it for higher value homes. And that is because the public benefit you're receiving, that tax increment, is higher when the end product home is a higher value home. So you're working against a little bit of a market incentive to use this to build as high value homes as possible. And while we need all homes, that's not going to meet the needs of those 15,000 Vermonters. So we took the liberty of thinking about how can you further focus this program on that low and moderate income demographic. And you started the discussion here this morning looking at that purpose language, which is the Commerce Committee really strengthened by weaving it through the bill, making it a requirement in different areas of the program. But the step they didn't take that I think they're leaving up to the Housing Committee is to look at that definition of what do we really mean by low and moderate income homes. And because I am not a fiction writer, I wanted to look back at where do we have examples in Vermont's programs of other definitions and other strategies that have worked to focus incentives and benefits to that population. And one place that we've seen this work in the past is the priority housing provision. That is a regulatory incentive for affordable housing that we've had in place for probably a decade or so. And what that provision says that is, if you're creating a mixed income community, then you can bypass Act 250. And it has an affordability definition and threshold that I think is really a helpful model that I want to point this committee towards.
You need to share your screen, or do you want to?
Let me talk through it. If
Okay.
you want to, I can also bring it up if you want to see it.
Well, whichever you want. Okay.
Yeah. So what it defines affordable housing as is for rental housing, that's 20% of the housing must be affordable. And for rental, affordable means up to 80% AMI. Must be rented at up to 80% AMI. And because AMI can be hard to conceptualize, I want to bring an example of what that looks like for income. So the statewide 80% AMI for the statewide average is 80,000 for a 3-person household. So a parent with 2 kids or 2 working adults and a kid. So that's where we're talking. We're talking rental apartment, affordable up to 80, household making 80,000. So that's about 2,000 to 2,300 a month. And for home ownership, it goes to
2,300 what a month?
dollars. Yeah. The rent.
The rent.
The apartment would be renting at around $2,000 a month. For home ownership, the definition goes further because it really wants to capture that moderate as well as low income definition. So it goes to 120% AMI. So for that 3-person household, we're now talking about an income of up to $121,000. And what this definition is looking at is really housing costs, looking at the sale price. And that's about $367,000 to $422,000. For some reason, the number of bedrooms, the difference. So those are the homes we're talking about. But VHCB focuses a lot on deeply affordable homes. This is really a market-driven solution. You heard Alex talking about sizing the requirement to the level of subsidy going into the project. And I think this is a requirement that is not that deeply affordable, but really looks at creating that mixed income community that we need to see built out here in Vermont if we're going to house our carpenters, our auto techs, our healthcare professionals. If we're going to provide the economic development we want to see here, we need to see homes that are $350,000 to $400,000 for sale price and renting at up to $2,000 a month. I think the way you can get at this in the bill is to add more specific definitions around what you mean as low or moderate income and that purpose, and to add language in this purpose saying that 20%, at least 20% of the homes must be low and moderate income. And that would be the rest of the work has been done for you by the Commerce Committee by referring back to that purpose language in the original plan that the municipality enters into and in the VEPC review. So it's just additional definition there. Maybe I will pause for a second and see what's helpful to the committee at this point.
Questions so far? I have a question. Is this housing priority areas, you say, priority housing, is that definition is exempt from Act 250?
So the background on the priority housing provision, this was a provision that was added into Act 250 that said if a development meets the threshold of being a priority housing project, if 20% of the homes are affordable, then it is exempt from Act 250. It can bypass that regulatory review. And where we've seen this have a great impact is really in getting affordable housing units into master developments. So if a developer wants to build a new neighborhood, they now have a great incentive to include some of the neighborhood, make sure some of the neighborhood is affordable at those levels. And that's either looked like the developer themselves, a private for-profit developer, financing those units, or it's looked like them partnering with a Twin Pines Housing Trust, a Champlain Housing Trust, one of our affordable housing developers who do a portion of those. So a project example that is coming in front of the HCB's board is a project in Hartford, Sykes Mountain Avenue, a private developer is building 240 homes, which is fantastic. In order to bypass Act 250, save that time, save that money, they're partnered with Twin Pines Housing Trust to make sure 48 of those homes are affordable. Without that provision, you don't have that incentive for affordability. And so we've seen that provision be really powerful in ensuring there's some affordable homes being built in these communities. And we think it's a model that could be really powerful here to continue to ensure that as we're using public dollars to subsidize housing, a portion of those are affordable to low and moderate to middle income Vermonters.
Question. Is what about size of development? I mean, what do you do? Obviously, this is a concern because so many of the housing projects that we imagine that might occur in rural, particularly in rural areas, are very small. Literally, it could be 2 houses, it could be 4 houses, 5. I guess my question is, what do we do with those? And another is, what do we do when a project really is so small, I mean, 48 units, affordable or whatever it is, that's a lot of units. It's worth it to work out whatever you do with Twin Pines, but if you're talking 2 units, are you really gonna find a for-profit housing developer to help you out? Or are you just gonna be forced to bob onto the market housing, the added price that, you need to subsidize those?
I think that's a really important concern that you're raising. And in listening to the debate around this program through the building, there's been this focus on how are we building a housing program that's serving our small emerging developers, that's serving our rural communities. And so I think that a policy suggestion there would be having a threshold, a minimum unit number after which the affordability criteria, the inclusionary criteria kick in. I don't know exactly what that number might be, but maybe between 10 and 15 units. If you're over that, then you need to start to make sure that you're including homes that are reflective of the needs of the community. If you're under that, there's an acknowledgement that it is harder to do that because you can't cross subsidize as much.
Do you usually see, like, an example you just gave, what was it, the development's working with Twin Pines? I can see that you would want someone to manage the low-income housing units, but was Twin Pines able to provide any source of subsidy?
No, Twin Pines, however, their development model, their building model is around building affordable housing. They have that market expertise. So it is easier for them to navigate the funding sources, the compliance, the long-term stewardship of those properties than the master developer who didn't want to do that. They saw a local partner that could do it. And it was expedient to do so.
I guess what I was asking is whether that navigation included access to tax credit financing or other financing that helped the developer pay for that subsidy. In other words, is it just straight inclusionary where the developer is just pricing all the housing accordingly? Or is that when you work with a nonprofit partner, is the benefit that you're getting access to knowledge that will help you get tax credits or other sources of income?
Certainly, I think that's why that partnership's taken place. But we've also seen many for-profit developers build this housing and manage this housing on their own. I think you hear a lot about the Summit project in Middlebury as an example.
Please.
Did you bring this idea and language to Commerce?
We did, yes.
And it sounds like they wanted us to hear it. Did they give any input?
They discussed it briefly. They were looking at really wanting a further incentive for including affordable housing. And I think the incentive here is that you are using tax dollars to help finance this private development. So that's what I see as the underlying incentive. They wanted more, and they felt like this was too much of a stick and not enough of a carrot. I think the carrot's underlying.
They were, just to help her out, they were considering some rather elaborate approaches, including, for example, allowing a greater percentage of the increment than 78, was it 80?
It was 80%.
They were gonna do that. It's just that some people argue, you change the increment, but some people argue it just doesn't pencil out.
The affordable housing, like to go back to why there's an inherent incentive to build high value housing. Affordable housing is going to have a lower assessed value. It's going to have, because of that, lower property taxes. And so there's just not the same capacity. So if I'm a developer looking at how do I fund all these infrastructure improvements, there needs to be something to encourage them to do that.
First, I'll say I definitely don't disagree. I've said it multiple times in this room and outside of this room. Vermont's very good at making the McMansions, but we're also very good at building subsidized housing. I guess my question is, how do you see this being able to be administered? Like, how do you think that would work?
It would make sense to hear from the predecessor to the Land Use Review Board that administered PHP, the Priority Housing Project provision, and how they were able to do that, and whether that's something Betsy could take on or another state department.
What you're saying, as I understand it, this priority housing project concept exists and it's administered. Sometimes private developers just do it themselves. Sometimes they partner with nonprofits.
Yes. So I think we want to, for simplicity's sake, in order to keep this really important program moving forward, use an example in Vermont policy that's already there, already working.
Do you know if priority housing has ever been enforced in the state?
I mean, it's certainly for those units that include public subsidy, there's assurance through that. And again, I'd have to defer to, I'm sorry, their name is now escaping me now that they have the LURB acronym.
You should be.
NRB.
Thank you, Alex.
What is NRB?
Natural Resources Board.
Yeah.
Oh, they do it?
They did it for priority housing projects.
Yeah. And now it's LURB?
But because the reason why we had this report that I started with, look at incentives for affordable housing, because this priority housing project, this really important incentive, is with the Reforms Act 250, it's going away for a good reason, because we've let all housing bypass Act 250 in these downtown locations that priority housing projects spoke to. So it's for a good reason. PHP is no longer relevant, but it is absolutely a loss for our efforts to make inclusionary communities.
Have you seen a decrease in willingness to build, or
It hasn't happened yet.
because
Because
we don't know if it would? We're just making an assumption.
we're making an assumption that 240 home development would generate more income, more profit for the developer if they didn't have to hold rents down for the affordable units. So maybe out of the goodness of his heart, he would have done that. But probably the rest of the units would be at that market rate.
Any other questions of Polly? Polly, thank you so much.
Thank
Oh,
you.
one. Did you have a question?
No, I was just
Okay.
saying thank you.
One thing, Polly submitted to me draft language, which I just got. Well, actually, I got it last night, but I slept. So I have it. What I'll do is provide it. Actually, Polly, let's short circuit that. Would you provide that language to Magali? She'll give it to the committee.
I'm happy to. Would you like me to kind of, that, I hadn't seen the changes Commerce had done yet, in terms of linking the purpose language through the bill and using that as the trigger for.
If you would like to take a few minutes and fool with it,
Mhm.
that would be great.
Okay.
I mean, we wouldn't mind your version too. But we do.
Have lawyers to fool with it.
Right, whatever, but we are on a tight schedule in that we feel strongly that we're gonna have to put this whole bill together and get it out of here Friday afternoon, which means, some people say that's forever from now. Some people say, oh my God, it depends how you think about it. So sooner would be better than later.
I'll put it together during the lunch hour.
Just to the committee.
Okay, All right, thank
Thank
you, Polly.
you for working on this.
Before we, let's take a few minutes before we adjourn for lunch.
Oh, you said it. No.
I don't,
She
I
knows.
said
Before we go to lunch.
before we go to lunch. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I've asked if it's okay with the committee. I've asked Magali to reach out to the CT. I think
Josh is over
saw
there.
Josh. Just because I know that they were in commerce, but I think some of the changes that we've discussed, I think that they might have input, and I think for me, it would be helpful. I'm hoping that input would also be helpful for the committee. So I've asked Magali to schedule that, and I hope that's great.
And we're coming back here at right after the floor. So I'm not gonna get up and say 10 minutes after the floor, just everybody get right back here. And then we're going to hear Nancy Owen, who's the president of Evernorth. Evernorth is actually, they operated 2 or 3 states. We've heard one of their people, help me out, Kathy Byer. We've heard Kathy Byer testify on various, remember when we were sort of educating ourselves on price and how this stuff works and how tax increment financing works and everything. Kathy was in here. This, Nancy Owen is the president of Evernorth and is essentially a financing. They work with all kinds of local nonprofits and developers to develop affordable housing in 3 states, or 2 or 3, I'm not sure, including Vermont. They're based in Burlington. So we'll hear from Nancy, and we're going to hear from the town manager of Chester, which just happened by chance to be the town represented by one of our members. And the purpose of that is to get the perspective of a small town looking at projects that are associated with a small town,
Good.
which I think is really
great.
important. So, and then when we're done with that, unless Magali has arranged more testimony for us, we will adjourn at that point. Any questions before I say the A word?
Well, we will have VLCT in now as well.
Oh, in the afternoon.
Yes.
Not before lunch.
Not.
No, well, we have
wouldn't do
7
that to you.
minutes.
Wouldn't
We
do
have
that to
7
you, Josh.
minutes. Josh, can you get it done in 2? No. I think we're set, and we